So I've been labelled a young Earth evolutionist by Answers in Genesis. Answers in Genesis have just published a series of articles where they claim that a number of young Earth creationists, myself included, are actually something called young Earth evolutionists. Here is what they said in one of these articles. A new wrinkle in sneaking evolution into the church is something we are terming young Earth evolution. Subtle ideas that don't comport with scripture or are unnecessarily accommodating of evolutionary ideas are causing problems within the church, confusing the people in the pews. But as I will demonstrate, all young Earth creationist scientists incorporate, and this is really important, modified evolutionary ideas, at least to some extent, into their creationist frameworks, and Answers in Genesis is no exception. Let me explain. When Charles Darwin wrote his Origin of Species in 1859, creationists of Darwin's day, whether old Earth creationists or young Earth creationists, they didn't believe that the zebra and the horse were members of the same created kind. The creationists of Darwin's day believed in something called the fixity of species and staunchly rejected the idea of speciation. It was actually Charles Darwin who successfully overturned the fixity of species doctrine, favoring instead the common ancestry of the zebra and the horse. He says this in The Origin: "How inexplicable on the theory of creation is the appearance of stripes on the shoulder and legs of the several species of the horse genus and in their hybrids. How simply is this fact explained if we believe that these species have descended from a striped progenitor." As it turns out, all modern creationists, Answers in Genesis included, now fully accept the common ancestry of zebras, donkeys, and horses. Now, some might object and say, well, that's microevolution or that's natural selection. But those mechanisms are not found anywhere in the Bible. Natural selection, microevolution, adaptationism in a purely Darwinian sense, and speciation, as well as a plethora of other mechanisms that creationists, including Answers in Genesis, use in their model building, were developed by Darwin and the early evolutionists first. In fact, if you lived in the mid to late 1800s and believed that the zebra and the horse shared a common ancestor, you would have been labeled an evolutionist. Creationists didn't distinguish between the legitimacy of microevolution over here and the heretical nature of macroevolution over there. It's only later that creationists began to make those distinctions, and it's for that reason that this quote by Answers in Genesis has absolutely no objective value. For example, Answers in Genesis' full acceptance of speciation, and that's when a group within a species separates and becomes its own species, would have been considered anathema by early creationists who would have accused Answers in Genesis of the same things that they are accusing me and others of in this quote. Okay, so let's crank things up a little bit. The Ark Encounter in Kentucky, one of Answers in Genesis' premier attractions, houses thousands of museum-quality animal exhibits that collectively demonstrate the reliability of many of the historical aspects associated with Noah's flood. I've been there with my family and I highly recommend going. One of the most remarkable exhibits in the Ark is the horse exhibit, where the ancestor to our modern horse, Equus, is identified as Mesohippus, an extinct three-toed horse that from a conventional perspective lived about 35 million years ago. Now, importantly for our discussion, Mesohippus differs substantially from modern Equus. Perhaps the most iconic difference can be found in the number of toes. Mesohippus has 3 toes on each foot, while our modern Equus has only 1. It is, however, the modifications found in the teeth that are most significant. You see, Mesohippus had low-crowned molars, while Equus has high-crowned molars that are deeply buried in both the upper and the lower jaw. Now, here's what's significant. Not all creationists are on the same page here. Some creationists are actually opposed to the diversification of the horse, and they've used this difference in particular to argue against Mesohippus being in the equine family tree. Consider this article by Mats Molen writing for Creation Ministries International. The change of tooth structure from bunodont, low-crowned with rounded cusps, to hypsodont, high-crowned, is not just supposed microevolution, but a complete change in design, even though it may not seem to be much of a new thing for those not acquainted with tooth construction. Now, whether Molen is right or wrong remains to be seen, and it's not important anyway. What is important is that Answers in Genesis have publicly portrayed Mesohippus as being in the equine family tree. But the diversification of the horse from Mesohippus is not a creationist idea. Once again, it is a secular idea that has been developed by the evolutionary community for over 100 years. So although Answers in Genesis do rightly reject the idea of mutations and millions of years equals equus, they once again are accepting of other ideas that were first developed by the evolutionary community. And although Answers in Genesis have no official position on the diversification of the horse, their public stance has changed over the past few decades. Consider this quote from an Answers in Genesis article that was published nearly 30 years ago and is still available online that clearly rejects the diversification of the horse, which importantly for the topic at hand was at that time called horse evolution by most creationists. My research has left me troubled. Why do science textbooks continue to use the horse as a prime example of evolution when the whole schema is demonstrably false? Why do they continue to teach our kids something that is not scientific? Notice what the author says. He says that the whole schema is demonstrably false. Now, since Mesohippus appears somewhere down the bottom of that schema, at least from an evolutionary perspective, what do you think that author would think if he was walking through the stalls of AIG's Ark Encounter today? Okay, now that we have some context, let's go back and have a look at that young Earth evolutionist quote again. A new wrinkle in sneaking evolution into the church is something we are terming young Earth evolution. Subtle ideas that don't comport with scripture or are unnecessarily accommodating of evolutionary ideas are causing problems within the church, confusing the people in the pews. Now, since many young Earth creationists still do not accept the diversification of the horse from a Mesohippus-like ancestor, would it be fair of them to say to Answers in Genesis that they are unnecessarily accommodating of evolutionary ideas? In fact, given their stance on horse diversification over the past 30 years, would it be fair for them to say about the AIG exhibits in the Ark Encounter that they are causing problems within the church and confusion with people in the pews? That this has actually occurred has been well documented in some of AIG's readers' response sections. Here are just two examples from Answers in Genesis supporters. In the kids section of the January-March issue, the Mesohippus is given as an ancestor of the modern horse. That sounds like the typical evolutionary mantra. What evidence is there of such a relationship between the small three-toed animal and Equus caballus? Couldn't Mesohippus have just been an odd kind by itself? Now, the AIG writer, and I think accurately, responds with these words. Regarding the number of toes, certain equids, like the large, modern-looking Dinohippus, had both one- and three-toed individuals within the same species. So body size and number of toes can vary greatly, even within a species, let alone the larger created kind. This would not be evolution, but variation within a kind. Here's another letter from another confused Answers in Genesis supporter. The article by Mike Belknap and Tim Chafee, Reimagining Ark Animals, caused me some anguish because it sounded like all the just so stories from evolutionists. How could a tiger, for example, appear from a mating of the cat kind depicted in the article? Now, here's part of AIG's response, which once again I think is right on the money. Evolution involves change that is random, slow, and unlimited. Creation involves change that is purposeful, relatively fast, and limited by design within a prescribed range, even if it sometimes appears drastic. Clearly then, and apart from their full acceptance of microevolution, natural selection, and speciation, Answers in Genesis have used other modified evolutionary ideas to help them construct the animals in the Ark Encounter exhibits. But let me come to Answers in Genesis' defense here. Does that mean that Answers in Genesis are sneaking evolution into the church? Well, of course not. It doesn't mean that they have compromised in any way whatsoever on a faithful interpretation of Genesis 1 to 11 as history. Again, of course not. Look, we can't change the past. As it turns out, Darwin was right about the adaptive capabilities of organisms and speciation. If it wasn't for his theory of natural selection, we might still believe in the fixity of species, classifying zebras and donkeys as different created kinds. But thanks to the work of creationists, we also know that Darwin took his ideas too far by proposing the common ancestry for all living organisms. Darwin didn't know about DNA, genes, and the complexity involved in generating phenotypic traits. Even today, scientists cannot agree on exactly how complex structures evolved, and some have even called for a complete overhaul of Darwinian evolution. On the other hand, old Earth creationists such as Stephen Meyer have successfully confirmed that genetic complexity requires a complex intelligence, and young Earth creationists such as Rainer Gilliuser have demonstrated that biological change requires an internal pre-programmed genetic blueprint that, as he says, contrasts starkly with the evolutionary framework's randomness of tiny accidental hit and miss phenotypes fractioned out to lucky survivors of deadly challenges. So in conclusion, claims such as this, although well-intentioned, can only bring with them more fear and more confusion. And that's because Answers in Genesis themselves have adopted various modified evolutionary ideas. The way forwards here is not to take a step backwards. And I think that's exactly what Answers in Genesis are doing. In part 2, I will also demonstrate that Answers in Genesis have incorporated modified evolutionary beliefs into their geological and cosmological models as well, without, I might add, compromising on a faithful interpretation of Genesis 1. So that's all from me, Ken Coulson, here at Creation Unfolding. Look, if you were in any way blessed by this video, then please hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell as well for easier access to more videos as I upload them. I've got a website as well, www.creationunfolding.com. There's a book, and look, there's a PayPal donate link now in the description if you in any way feel so led to donate some money. And look, the most important thing that you could do is pray for me. If you could spend a minute and pray for me right now, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you and goodbye.